Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to once again another episode of Tanks with CS. Thankfully, it hasn't been too long this time, so I guess I'm glad to be here. So, anyways, today's video's theme is actually on a bunch relatively popular and well-known, perhaps, mid-tier tanks that ever famous during the Second World War, for the lack of a better word. Video features for replays. As you can see, we start with the T-34, Soviet medium tank, which was mass-produced. I believe there were over 50,000 copies of these made, in various variants, over the span of more than a decade. Some historians and military scientists could go as far as argue that, the T-34 was the tank that won the war. Not just with the Eastern Front, but essentially, arguably, the entire war at large. As you know, the tank essentially engaged the Japanese in 45 also, and arguably the Russian front was really the decisive front of the war, statistically speaking. And of course, after this, we do have a replay on the Panzer IV, German, and also M4 Sherman. Hentai, we'll get there. So anyways, another reason why these replays are being featured is, I guess once upon a time I promised a bunch of my clanmates that, these quote good games will be online for their viewing and for their enjoyment. So I guess to keep my promise, here I am. But anyways, in this game, I guess the T-34 is a bit of a strange tank. It's fairly mobile. Engine's pretty powerful, but the ground resistance for the tank isn't great. So that kind of balance out the tank's agility. Overall, I would say that on flat ground, it feels a bit clumsier than the Panzer IV or M4, but it seems to be a little better at hill climbing. In terms of armor, I guess compared to the other tier 5s you typically see, such as M4 and Panzer IV, the T-34 does feature more angles with its armor. So sometimes, if you position yourself carefully, you can be reasonably well protected. Sometimes enemy shots can be trolled, if you will. But then and again, the entire hull of the tank does not have more than 45mm of armor at any given spot. So perhaps the tank is not exactly invincible or immune if you're facing higher tier tanks, if you're facing gold spam, or if the enemy is spamming HE. Because HE doesn't really need to pen to do damage after all. In terms of weapon choices, the T-34 does have 3 different versions of 76mm guns available, as well as this 57mm gun I have on my tank. Overall, I would say that, and as probably many others will suggest, the 76mm aren't great because they have questionable penetration, questionable handling, and pretty questionable DPM as well. The 57mm has pretty good penetration. I believe it's 112mm, which is definitely sufficient for tier 5. It has no problem going through most tier 6s and many tier 7s. And if you flank, you have no problem dealing with anybody matchmaking might put you up against. The hard staff of the gun is actually pretty good aside from penetration. Accuracy is good. Aim time doesn't seem to be that long. But in a sense, the weapon is being balanced out with questionable bloom and soft step handling characteristics in practice. So essentially, if you want to shoot as fast as you can reload, your gun simply does not aim fast enough or much rather the bloom, does not simply reduce itself sufficiently for you to effectively engage enemies with any reasonable degree of accuracy at medium to long range at all. So in other words, the weapon is a bit of a medium to short range skirmishing weapon that's almost kind of like a bit of a spray and pray type of weapon in practice. But as you can see, as I engage this E-25, if you're close enough, it's hard to miss. And your DPM can chew up a lot of things. Even this very overpowered, much rather powerful tank destroyer that's 2 tiers higher than myself. It is what it is. And so the second replay for today's video is actually on the Panzer IV, German Tier 5 medium tank. I believe the Panzer IV has the distinction of being the most produced turreted tank the Wehrmacht fielded in World War II. It's also known for being the only German tank model that had been produced from the beginning to the very end of the war. Consider Panzer I and II were mostly phased out after 1940-1941. The Panzer III tagged along to 42 and 43, and kind of mostly got converted into assault guns like the Stug afterward, because they were undergunned due to the limitations of their smaller turret. And of course, the Tiger came along in late 42, the Panzer came along in 43, and the Tiger II came along in 44. And of course, you have monsters like Yak Tigers and Mouses, but this was essentially the standard universal tank the Germans had. Of course, originally at the beginning of the war, I believe Heinz Guderian, who was the Inspector General of the Panzer troops, originally envisioned the Panzer IV as being more of an infantry support vehicle. They utilized a 75mm howitzer and was to be used in conjunction with Panzer IIIs, which were the slightly smaller, more agile tanks that were armed with a high-velocity anti-tank weapon, the 37 and later 50mm. But just simply because the power creep in the war. Ironically, I had to use that term, considering there's power creep in the game too. Essentially, the greater potential, the larger size, and heavier weight of this vehicle afforded it the flexibility to arm with a high-velocity 75mm that essentially allowed the tank to remain competitive towards the end of the war. Or maybe not competitive, but at least sufficient, I guess. And of course, my tank in this game is actually using a 105mm howitzer, which arguably is not historically accurate, as the Germans, according to the records, never installed such a weapon on the tank. But perhaps this was introduced in the game for balance reasons. The concept is obviously kind of modeled after the howitzer-armed M4s that the Americans used in 44 and 45 in Western Europe against German fortifications. But I guess, the playstyle for this tank is drastically different than the T-34. First and foremost, because the weapon selection and the choice of this gun. Instead of trying to work with a fast reload, lower alpha, and high penetrating weapon that requires AP rounds to penetrate enemy armor, you are essentially using a high explosive firing, slower reload, inconsistent DPM weapon that essentially splashes enemies. And of course, even though penetrating is good, it's not necessarily mandatory or always needed when you're using this weapon. Because sometimes, you want to cause module damage, sometimes you want to kill enemy crews, sometimes you simply want to track the enemy vehicles and hold them in place. And obviously from that point onward, if your friendlies damage the stationary enemy vehicle, you get credited for the assist. Which is I guess a practical and productive practice, if you will. And of course, one of the trade-offs of such a lower velocity and shorter barreled weapon is the fact that the shell velocity is slower, as well as the fact that the weapon is less accurate than a higher velocity weapon. Even though if you aim carefully and if your cruise is sufficiently good, you have snapshot and smooth ride and so on and so forth, perhaps you have a vent and I guess just set up your tank properly, the tank has no problem sniping at all. Maybe not sniping while snap shooting, but still, it's serviceable. One thing to note about a howitzer or a derp gun tank is the fact that simply because you have a longer reload, a higher per shot potential damage, even though your penetration is somewhat insufficient, if you will, if you aim to pen, it actually affords you a high degree of safety because you can shoot and then pull back into hard cover and be protected from returning enemy fire. Since this is a major advantage over the T-34, because as with the T-34, if you want to utilize damage potential in DPM, you more or less have to expose yourself. As moving your tanks essentially kills off your handling and DPM even more, because it causes more bloom and destroys your accuracy, if you will. I guess another good thing about Panzer IV is the fact that the tank does have pretty good depression when you're shooting towards the front of the tank. But I guess as a tip, I think one should also realize that the tank doesn't really have that much depression towards the sides, simply because the armor skirts kind of blocks the barrel of the gun. In terms of absolute mobility, the Panzer IV has less ground resistance than T-34, even though correspondingly perhaps the engine is a little weaker in comparison. And in practice, unfortunately, the tank is limited to a 40 km/h speed limit. So that kind of limits your mobility to an extent.
One of our tracks is damaged.
And in terms of armor, the frontal hull of the Panzer IV, it's sufficient, even though it lacks the angles you see on the T-34. It is 80 millimeters, even though it's boxy. I guess, even though it lacks natural angling, if you position yourself carefully, if you use cover well, and since you got the depression to utilize terrain features, you can do okay with it. And after all, the frontal hull is 80 millimeters, not much less than the Tiger's 100 millimeter. Even though, unfortunately, this game, being a Tier 7, the Tiger is essentially a cardboard box. As it's constantly being matched against super weapons of the Cold War, which obviously in real life never really happened. Unfortunately, the turret for the Panzer IV is a bit of a weak spot. I believe, if you ignore the space armor on the side and dismantle it, the frontal plate for the turret is only 50 millimeter, which is a notable weak spot. And consider the size of the turret and the importance of the turret, it's really not a small weak spot at all. So make sure, you try not to get shot there, because, some Tier 3 weapons can actually go through it. So that's definitely something one should take into consideration when playing this tank, I guess.
Enemy armor is destroyed.
And of course, the Panzer IV does have better reload than the M4, arguably better gun handling, and fairly decent vision. consider I have optics installed on this tank, which is quite a big deal for a mid-tier tank because sometimes your enemies are blind, so it's important to try to make the most out of such advantage, if you will. So here we are, our third replay for the day. I'm in my M4 Sherman, American Tier 5 medium tank. You can say that this is a bit of a legendary tank. Some people call this the American counterpart to the Russian T-34 and arguably the German Panzer IV.
Let's go.
It was obviously mass-produced in the tens of thousands. The way I set up this tank is actually historically accurate. As in, a non-EZA Panzer IV can be equipped with a short-barreled, low-velocity 105mm howitzer. And this was the tank the Americans used against German fortifications in the Western Front in 1944. So, the American 105mm howitzer has a longer reload than the German 105mm. The penetration is about the same, damage potential is slightly higher, and the handling is worse. It has more bloom, unfortunately. Even though I decided to equip a tank with a wind and train my crew in smooth ride and snapshot, so this looks okay, I guess.
Critical hit. Critical hit. Critical
And
hit.
here's something that you're gonna want to do with the Durban tank is
Critical
you
hit.
can more or less keep the enemy in place by splashing their tracks, but because you're shooting HE rather than AP, regardless of the angle and orientation of the enemies, most likely your HE will at least do some damage and keep the enemy in place.
Enemy is hit.
But of course, if you're shooting at enemies with relatively low armor,
Critical hit.
the 50 or so millimeter of penetration on the 105mm howitzer's high explosive shell would just simply go through and do massive damage. 400 HP, give or take. And that amount of damage is absolutely devastating at this tier.
Critical hit.
Some tanks at this tier can essentially be one-shotted with that much alpha.
They're knocked out.
And of course, being high explosive, if the enemies are insufficiently armored, you do massive module damage.
Critical hit. Track hit.
And here's the thing, I'm being face-hugged by a T-29 American Tier 7 heavy tank, but I ended up derping him twice and killing him. I did get some help from a friendly. It took out the enemy's health, but once again, sometimes you just need a little damage. You don't need to penetrate. You don't need to
Penetration.
seriously alpha strike the enemy, but you just simply need to push things over the brink to get out of dodge,
Enemy armor is destroyed.
and that's what happened. Meanwhile, after that, I managed to corner enemy Hellcat, which essentially has as much armor as a soda can, and
Critical hit. We're immobilized.
so in that case, I essentially do massive damage. He has absolutely no ability to stop the penetration of my HE ammo at all. In terms of armor, I guess in a sense the M4 falls in between the Panzer IV and T-34 in terms of armor thickness and armor design. In a sense that I believe the M4's frontal hull is about 2 inches or 50mm give or take, which is thicker than the T-34 but thinner than the M4. It lacks the side angling and the rear angling the T-34 has, but the frontal hull of the M4 it's angled, unlike the Panzer IV. But to an extent, the angling in the front of the M4 it's not as extreme as the T-34. So once again, it falls in between. In terms of mobility, it feels as if it's slightly slower to accelerate compared to the M4, but not as sluggish as the T-34. Meanwhile, in terms of top speed, it also falls in between the other two. So overall, it's a very balanced and highly functional, highly usable tank. People say it's vanilla and mundane and middle of the road, but it's absolutely fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I like it. And last but not the least, we have a replay with also the M4, except this is technically the Sherman 3, which is the version of the M4 that was lend-leased into the British Army service, if you will. My setup on this tank is actually different than my American M4 in the sense that I'm using a binocular telescope versus coated optics, partly because I kind of ran out of curlets and I kind of ran out of equipment I have in storage, so I had to work with what I have. And another thing to note is the fact that in this game, my crew is not even yet 100%. They're very close to being 100%, but I believe this was actually the very last game in which my crew was not 100%. And obviously there were no skills or perks involved. So no smooth ride, no snapshot, no off-road driving. So perhaps I'm a bit gimped, unfortunately. But then, you know, this replay will perhaps showcase one of the things you can do well, and one of the things you want to do in American design medium tank, not just at this tier, but even up to tier 9 or tier 10. They may not have the best weapon handling, they may not be the most heavy armored, but the way their armor is set up, and the way the turrets are designed, and the fact that they do have a semi-reliable mantlet and reasonable upper plate with good depression, kind of allows this tank to peak ridges very well. In other words, you can provide recon and scouting vision for the friendlies without risking yourself. And obviously this is something that you can't really do with the T-34, as the T-34 has less depression. But then, you know, this is also something you can't really do in the Panzer IV, because the Panzer IV, even though it has good depression, the turret armor for the Panzer IV is really insufficient for this role. Sure, you can peek out, but you know, if the enemy return fire, you're much more vulnerable in a Panzer IV in comparison to if you're in an M4. I guess another thing to note is the fact that, you know, because I had to rely on movements to avoid return fire from the enemies, such a movement kind of disallows my binocular telescope to activate. And I believe this is one of the reasons why many experienced players will usually choose coated optics over telescopes, as the fact that, you know, they will always work, versus the binoculars that will only work after you have been stationary for a while. Of course, you can make arguments to say that, you know, if you're playing armored camper second line tank destroyers, maybe binoculars are better, and you can argue they are, because, you know, their vision bonus is greater versus 10% on the coated optics. But then once again, not every single tank is usable with that playstyle. So I guess it's all about compromises. And as with this map, Fire Resilient, I hate to say, but this is essentially, according to myself, my most hated map in the entire game. Because it's a bit of a map that kind of has insufficient hard cover, but too much soft cover. And he essentially punishes teams that doesn't know vision and camo mechanics well, but then just like every single team. So when you have to work with and rely on friendlies who are inexperienced and incompetent, the game quickly descends into a passive campfast. That just become more or less unbearable, for lack of a better word. And the binocular activates and assist duel and aim down to get rid of my bloom in order to snipe the enemies on the hill. Even though, as you can see, the weapon does not handle great at all. And sometimes, even a fully aimed shots will miss. But then, this is the trade-off. Because, with this setup, you don't have to penetrate the enemy to do damage. As long as you touch them, you kiss them, you are making a difference, for lack of a better word.
Critical hit.
Because ultimately the alternative is to run the 75mm or, which the British were designed for, perhaps the 6-pounder, which has about 100mm worth of penetration. Sure, against tier 5 and tier 6s and lower, you can probably DPM and pen the enemies and do fairly okay. But the reality is that, with that setup, if you're faced against, let's say, a T-29 or a Tiger P or a Japanese heavy at tier 7, you might as well have serious problems.
Critical hit.
Right now, I know the enemy has a fairly weak T-28 that's capping, who I can one-shot with no problem because he has no armor and insufficient health. So I decided to let him cap and gain more points, so that once I reset, I will get an XP bonus from resetting those cap points. Meanwhile, I managed to derp gun track and mobilize the enemy Stuck 3 and finish him off. That just highlights the limitations of a tank without a turret, and also the usability of HE mechanic to immobilize and annihilate the enemies in certain situations.
Enemy armor is destroyed.
As I said, there goes the T-28. He had no chance. He's a bit of a glass cannon, unfortunately. So the T-34 game, I got Ace Tanker with no other awards. Perhaps the other T-34 players at that point weren't doing so well, but you can also argue that, being the top in damage as well as, being able to finish off an enemy T-25 that was distracted was sufficient to get me to where I am, I guess. And as with the Panzer 4 game, it was an Ace Tanker game once again. Not exactly the first Ace Tanker game I ever had in tank, but it was an Ace Tanker game. And even though, I didn't do the most in damage, it shows that, if you know how to utilize terrain features and hardcover and camo and vision mechanics, and have a tank with sufficient spotting range, you can do fairly well. by helping your team instead of doing damage yourself. As with M4, that game turned out to be my very first ace tanker game in the M4 after owning the tank for over a year. Obviously, the tank's user-friendliness and balanced performance, the flexibility afforded me the win. It just happened to work out right, in the right game at the right place at the right time. And the British Sherman game also turned out to be a first ace tanker game for the tank model in question. Once again, the ability to abuse terrain features and gun depression and vision really helped the team win the game. But anyways, thanks for watching. Hopefully I'll have more videos coming up. See you next time.